Emily Parker was famous in Willow Creek. She was the kind of person who made you smile every time you saw her. A single mother of two, Emily had built a life for herself and her children, working as an office manager at a local law firm. She was known for her kindness, her hard work, and the love she poured into her family. But one evening, everything changed. Emily didn't come home. Her children waited for hours, calling her phone and leaving messages, but there was no response. By morning, when she still hadn't returned, her daughter Lily, frantic and scared, called the police. Something was wrong. Emily wasn't the type to disappear without a word. The investigation started quickly, but there were few clues to go on. Emily's car was still parked in front of her house, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The police canvassed the area, spoke to neighbors, and reviewed nearby surveillance footage, but nothing pointed to where Emily might have gone. Her ex-husband, Tom, seemed genuinely concerned, but he wasn't in town when she disappeared. The case quickly grew cold, leaving the family feeling more helpless with each passing day. Emily's mother, Linda, couldn't understand how this could happen to her daughter, someone so full of life, love, and promise. She refused to give up, though. Emily's disappearance wasn't just another case. It was personal, and she would not rest until she found answers. As the days turned into weeks, the Parker family was left in emotional turmoil. Emily's children, especially her teenage daughter, Lily, felt the weight of her absence the most. Every corner of the house reminded her of her mother, the scent of Emily's perfume lingering in the hallway, the dishes left half-finished in the sink. The silence in the house was deafening, and Lily found herself searching for answers in the smallest details: the unlocked door, the shoes Emily had left behind, the untouched phone on the kitchen counter. Her younger brother, Max, was too young to fully understand, but he missed his mom just as much. He clung to his sister, trying to find comfort in the familiar. But comfort was hard to find when there were so many questions. Why would Emily leave them? And if something bad had happened to her, who was responsible? The grief was unbearable for the family, but they couldn't give up hope. They hired a private investigator, a former police officer named Jake Collins, to dig deeper into Emily's life. Collins was known for solving cold cases, and the Parker family believed he might be their best chance. He started by looking into Emily's background, her relationships, and the people who might have known her best. But the deeper Jake dug, the more secrets started to surface, things Emily had kept hidden from even those closest to her. The private investigator was determined to follow every lead, no matter where it took him. As Jake continued to sift through the evidence, he started to realize that there might be more to Emily's disappearance than anyone could have imagined. Jake Collins didn't waste any time. He went over the phone records, speaking to the cell phone provider about Emily's last known calls. He discovered something unsettling. Just hours before she disappeared, Emily had made a call that lasted for just over 2 minutes. The number was unlisted and had no apparent connection to her. The call had been placed from her car, just a few miles away from her home. There was a sense of urgency in Emily's voice, but no one knew who she had been talking to. Jake requested the call records from the unlisted number, and after a few days of pushing the local authorities, he finally received the details. The number belonged to someone named Robert Hall, a man with a criminal record for petty theft and assault, but there was little else known about him. The call was a potential breakthrough, but it only raised more questions. Who was Robert Hall, and why had Emily been talking to him just before she vanished? Jake tracked down Robert's last known address. It was an old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and poorly kept lawns. When Jake arrived, he noticed the faint smell of cigarette smoke wafting from an open window. No one answered the door, so he left a note and asked to speak with Robert. For days, Jake waited for a response, but nothing came. Then, out of nowhere, Jake received a call from the local police. Robert Hall had been found, but not in the way they expected. He had been brutally attacked and left for dead, his body found in a nearby alley. The police were calling it a case of robbery gone wrong, but Jake had his doubts. He was starting to wonder if Robert had more to do with Emily's disappearance than anyone realized. As the investigation into Robert Hall's attack continued, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he had been targeted because of his involvement with Emily. Was he trying to protect someone? Or had he become a threat to those who wanted to keep their secrets buried? Jake began to look closer at the people in Emily's life, starting with her ex-husband, Tom. Tom had always been distant after the divorce, but he had remained friendly with Emily for the sake of the children. However, Jake found something troubling. Tom had been seen near the area where Emily's car had been found the night she disappeared. He claimed it was just a coincidence, but Jake wasn't convinced. Then there was Claire, Emily's co-worker, who had been acting strangely ever since Emily's disappearance. She had been one of the last people to see Emily before she vanished, and she seemed overly concerned about the investigation. Could Claire have been hiding something? But the more Jake investigated, the more tangled the web became. Everyone seemed to have something to hide. From Emily's best friend Sarah, who had a history of jealousy toward Emily's success, to the mysterious phone call from Robert Hall, there were too many unanswered questions. And yet, no one had a clear motive. No one seemed to know why Emily had disappeared or who was responsible. As Jake dug deeper, he started to wonder if the answer lay within Emily's secret life, a life she had kept hidden from everyone she loved. Jake's breakthrough came when he uncovered a hidden bank account under Emily's name. It wasn't large, but the amount of money in it seemed out of place. The account had been opened months before her disappearance, and the deposits had been made regularly. The mystery deepened when Jake traced the deposits to a man named Michael Grayson. Michael had no criminal record, but there were rumors that he had been involved in shady business dealings. Emily had been meeting with Michael on several occasions, and she had even made a trip to a nearby city to meet him a few weeks before she vanished. What was the connection between Michael and Emily? Why had she kept this hidden from her family? And was Michael involved in her disappearance? The investigation was reaching a critical point, and Jake knew he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. But there were still so many pieces to the puzzle, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. As Jake dug deeper into Michael Grayson's background, he discovered something chilling. Michael had been involved in a violent robbery years earlier, but the charges were mysteriously dropped, and he had quietly disappeared from the public eye afterward. When Jake questioned people who knew Michael back then, he learned that Michael had a tendency to surround himself with dangerous people. One name kept coming up: Robert Hall. It seemed that Michael and Robert had once been involved in a shady business deal, and the two had parted ways on bad terms. This revelation made Jake even more suspicious of the connection between Michael and Emily. Had Emily unknowingly stepped into something dark and dangerous? Was she an innocent victim, or had she been caught up in something that ultimately led to her disappearance? Jake's investigation into Michael Grayson intensified. He managed to track down one of Michael's old associates, a man named Victor, who had recently gotten out of prison. Victor was hesitant to talk at first, but after a few hours of questioning, he began to reveal some unsettling details. According to Victor, Michael had been running a series of underground operations, one of which involved human trafficking. Emily's name had never been mentioned, but the mention of a missing woman caught Victor's attention. Victor claimed that Michael had grown increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to Emily's disappearance. Jake knew that he had to get to Michael before he disappeared again, but the question was, what was Michael really hiding? Jake's investigation took a dangerous turn when his office was broken into. He had been working late one night when he returned to his office to find the door ajar. His heart raced as he walked inside, and he immediately noticed that his files were missing. The only thing left behind was a note scrawled on a piece of paper: "Stay out of this. You're in over your head." The message sent a chill down Jake's spine. Someone didn't want him digging into Emily's case, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to stop him. His gut told him that it was Michael Grayson, or someone connected to him, trying to intimidate him. But Jake refused to back down. He wasn't about to let anyone scare him away from finding the truth. The break-in left Jake feeling vulnerable, but it also fueled his determination. He knew the stakes were high. Emily's family had already suffered enough, and the community was still looking for answers. He decided to take a more aggressive approach. Jake reached out to local law enforcement and demanded additional resources for the case. With the help of the police, Jake traced Michael's whereabouts to a small property just outside of town. It was secluded, and there were no obvious signs of life. Jake had to be careful. He couldn't risk walking into a trap. Armed with new information and a renewed sense of urgency, Jake prepared for what could be his most dangerous move yet, confronting Michael Grayson face to face. Jake arrived at Michael Grayson's property early in the morning, just as the sun began to rise. He parked his car at a safe distance and crept toward the house, staying low to avoid detection. As he approached, he noticed that the windows were covered, and there was an eerie silence surrounding the place. Jake's pulse quickened as he reached the front door. He knocked loudly, his voice steady but firm as he called out Michael's name. After several moments, the door opened, revealing a man with a hardened face, Michael Grayson himself. Jake didn't waste any time. He introduced himself and immediately demanded answers. Michael's calm demeanor didn't fool Jake. He could see the tension in Michael's eyes as he tried to brush off the questions. Michael claimed he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance, but Jake could sense that he was lying. Michael tried to play the victim, claiming that he had been set up by someone else, but Jake wasn't buying it. He pressed Michael further, asking about the mysterious bank account, the secret meetings with Emily, and his connection to Robert Hall. Michael's facade began to crack as he grew more defensive. But just when Jake thought he was getting through, a loud noise interrupted them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and Jake was left standing on the porch, bewildered. Michael had retreated back inside, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. Jake's failed confrontation with Michael Grayson only intensified the mystery surrounding Emily's disappearance. The more he dug, the more complicated things became. It was clear that Michael had something to hide, but he wasn't talking. With no new leads, Jake decided to focus on Robert Hall again, who had been attacked shortly after his last interaction with Emily. Robert was still recovering in the hospital, and Jake knew he needed to speak to him as soon as possible. But time was running out. The longer Emily remained missing, the more frustrated her family became. Linda, Emily's mother, reached out to Jake, pleading with him to find answers. She couldn't understand why the police weren't making any progress. The public pressure was mounting, and Jake knew he had to get to the bottom of things, for Emily, her family, and his own peace of mind. Jake returned to the hospital where Robert Hall was being treated. He spoke to the doctors and managed to get permission to speak with Robert. When Jake entered Robert's room, the man looked different from the criminal Jake had imagined. Robert was bruised and battered, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made Jake pause. Robert was reluctant to speak at first, but after some gentle questioning, he finally opened up. He admitted to knowing Michael Grayson and having met Emily a few times, but he swore that he had no part in her disappearance. Robert claimed that the attack on him was a warning. Someone didn't want him talking. He insisted that the people he was involved with were dangerous, and he feared for his life. Robert's confession gave Jake a chilling realization. The web surrounding Emily's case was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. With Robert Hall's confession weighing heavily on his mind, Jake realized that the key to solving Emily's disappearance might be tied to something bigger than he had first thought. The human trafficking ring, Michael Grayson's shady operations, and Robert's involvement all pointed to a single undeniable truth. Emily had gotten too close to something she shouldn't have. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. Emily's secret meetings with Michael Grayson, the hidden bank account, and the strange phone call made hours before her disappearance were all part of a larger puzzle. Jake was beginning to see the full picture. But the question remained, was Emily alive? And if so, where was she? Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Emily's family was desperate for answers, and the pressure was mounting. With each passing day, Jake knew that the truth was within reach. But would he be able to uncover it before it was too late? With a renewed sense of urgency, Jake scoured the evidence he had gathered, hoping to uncover anything that could lead to Emily's whereabouts. He focused on the phone call that Emily had received hours before her disappearance. After cross-referencing phone records, Jake discovered that the call had come from a burner phone, untraceable but clearly important. He began contacting local and state authorities to see if there had been any recent reports of similar cases. That's when a chilling detail emerged. There had been multiple disappearances of young women in the surrounding areas, all connected to Michael Grayson's circle. The pattern was undeniable, and Jake knew he was now on the right track. Jake returned to Michael Grayson's property to conduct a thorough search, but when he arrived, the place was empty. The windows were open, and there was an unsettling silence in the air. Jake's heart raced as he searched every room, but it seemed that Michael had vanished once again. Just as Jake was about to leave, he noticed a strange symbol painted on the wall of Michael's basement. It was a symbol that Jake recognized. It was associated with underground human trafficking rings. The realization hit him hard. Emily was not just missing. She was likely part of something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. But what was Michael's ultimate goal? And where had he taken Emily? The deeper Jake dug, the more dangerous things became. Michael Grayson's disappearance only fueled Jake's suspicion that he was involved in something far larger than a simple missing person case. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about exposing a criminal empire that had been operating in the shadows for years. As Jake continued his investigation, he realized that he wasn't just up against Michael. He was up against a powerful network of individuals willing to do anything to protect their secrets. Jake received a phone call late one night that added another layer of complexity to the case. The caller was a woman who claimed to have once worked with Michael Grayson and knew his methods. She revealed that Michael had been working with an international syndicate involved in human trafficking, using his wealth and influence to shield himself from the law. The woman claimed to know where Emily was, but her voice shook with fear. She told Jake to meet her at a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town, but warned him that he was walking into a trap. The fear in her voice was enough to make Jake hesitate, but he knew he had no choice. Emily's life was on the line, and Jake had to take the risk. Jake's heart pounded as he approached the warehouse. The night was eerily quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. He parked his car at a distance and made his way toward the building. The dim lights inside illuminated a row of old crates, and the sound of muffled footsteps echoed through the empty space. When he entered, he saw a figure standing by one of the crates. It was the woman who had called him earlier. Her face was pale, and she looked around nervously. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Before Jake could ask any questions, he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Suddenly, armed men emerged from the shadows, their guns aimed at Jake. The woman let out a small cry, and before Jake could react, she was grabbed by two of the men and dragged into the darkness. Jake's mind raced as he realized the trap had been set for him. These men were part of the same network he had been investigating. But what did they want with him? And more importantly, where was Emily? As Jake fought to keep his composure, the leader of the group stepped forward. It was Michael Grayson. His calm demeanor was unnerving as he taunted Jake. "You've been asking too many questions, Detective," Michael said with a smirk. "It's time to stop." Jake's mind was spinning. Trapped in a warehouse with armed men closing in on him, he knew he had to think fast. He couldn't let Michael Grayson or his crew win. His training kicked in as he observed his surroundings, calculating every possible escape route. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Jake spotted something, a narrow window at the far end of the warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was his only chance. As Michael and his men closed in, Jake lunged toward a nearby stack of crates, using them for cover. He moved quickly and silently, praying the men wouldn't notice him. With every ounce of energy, Jake sprinted toward the window. He was almost there when one of the men spotted him and shouted, "He's making a run for it." Jake dove through the window just as a bullet grazed his arm. He landed hard on the ground outside but didn't stop. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to keep running. He had no choice. His only hope of saving Emily was to escape, regroup, and come up with a new plan. Jake knew he had just narrowly escaped death, but the chase was far from over. As he staggered through the streets, blood dripping from his arm, he realized that Michael Grayson and his network wouldn't stop until they had silenced him. Jake needed to warn the authorities, but he couldn't afford to trust anyone. Not yet. His mind raced as he pieced together everything he had learned so far. The human trafficking ring, the shadowy figures involved, and the brutal lengths they were willing to go to protect their secrets, it all pointed to one thing: Jake had become a target. That night, he patched up his wound and made a plan. He would reach out to a few trusted allies and work in the shadows, gathering information and getting closer to the truth without alerting Michael. But Jake wasn't just fighting for Emily anymore. He was fighting for his life, and the clock was ticking. With every passing day, Emily's chances of survival grew slimmer. The deadly game had begun, and Jake was determined to be the one to bring the truth to light, no matter what it took. After his narrow escape, Jake lay low for a few days, keeping a close eye on any movements from Michael Grayson's associates. He knew he couldn't go to the police just yet. They would never understand the full scope of what he had uncovered. Instead, Jake reached out to a private investigator named Sarah, an old colleague from his past cases. Sarah had a knack for digging into the underworld, and Jake knew she was the only one who could help him now. Together, they began digging into Grayson's financial records, uncovering connections to multiple illegal operations across the country. They found a series of shell companies linked to human trafficking networks, all of which had one thing in common: the presence of high-profile individuals in positions of power. Jake and Sarah quickly realized that this wasn't just a small-time operation. It was part of a much larger, more dangerous conspiracy. The stakes had grown higher, and the danger was closer than they could have ever imagined. But they couldn't back down now, not when Emily's life hung in the balance. To understand Michael Grayson's rise to power, Jake decided to dig deeper into his past. What he uncovered was disturbing. Grayson had started from nothing, a troubled young man with a penchant for manipulation. He had worked his way into circles of influence, initially starting with small-time crimes before gradually moving into more lucrative and dangerous ventures. He had used his charm, his wealth, and his connections to build an empire, all while staying one step ahead of the law. Through Sarah's research, they discovered a key turning point in Grayson's life: a mysterious disappearance that had occurred years ago. The victim had never been found, but there were whispers that Michael had been involved in some way. Jake connected the dots and realized that this case might have been the starting point for everything Grayson had built. If they could solve this cold case, it might lead them to Emily and bring down the whole criminal network. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous the path became. Jake and Sarah were closing in on their target, but it seemed the closer they got, the more obstacles appeared. One evening, while Jake was meeting Sarah in a dimly lit cafe, the worst happened. Sarah didn't show up. She was supposed to bring critical information about a new lead, but when Jake called her phone, there was no answer. His gut instinct told him something was wrong. He drove to her apartment, his heart pounding in his chest, but when he arrived, the place was ransacked. It was clear Sarah had been taken. Panic surged through Jake's veins. He had to act fast. He knew that Michael Grayson was behind this. It was a classic move: eliminate anyone who might be a threat. Jake's mind raced as he realized he had no choice but to return to the warehouse, the last place he had encountered Michael. He had to find Sarah before it was too late, but the risks were higher than ever. The trap was set, and Jake was walking right into it. Jake had no intention of being caught off guard again. He went to the warehouse prepared this time, armed with a gun and his wits. As he entered the familiar dark space, the cold air seemed to press in on him. The sounds of footsteps echoed, and Jake braced himself for a confrontation. Suddenly, Michael appeared from the shadows, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a sinister smirk. "You really thought you could stop me?" Michael taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, detective. It's time for you to realize you're just a pawn in a much larger game." Jake's anger flared. "I'm not a pawn," he retorted. "I'm the one who's going to bring you down." Michael laughed. the sound cold and menacing. "You think you can take me down? You have no idea what you're dealing with." In the distance, Jake could see Sarah, tied up and struggling against her restraints. He had to make a move, and fast. He lunged toward Michael, his gun raised, but Michael was quicker. A shot rang out, and Jake's world went dark. Jake woke up in an unfamiliar place, his body aching, and his head spinning. He was tied to a chair, but his mind was sharp. He had been captured, but he refused to give up. The sound of footsteps echoed as Michael approached, a look of victory on his face. "You should have stayed out of this, detective," he sneered. But Jake had one last trick up his sleeve. As Michael drew closer, Jake used his training to break free from the ropes, knocking Michael off balance. A brutal struggle ensued, but in the end, Jake emerged victorious. He freed Sarah and secured the warehouse, calling the authorities to take down Grayson's operation. Michael Grayson's empire was crumbling. But the fight wasn't over yet. Jake knew there was still much to be done. The human trafficking network was vast, and many more lives were at stake. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The authorities arrived at the warehouse just as Jake and Sarah were catching their breath. The police quickly secured the premises, arresting Grayson's men and seizing documents that would help break down the rest of the criminal network. As Michael Grayson was taken into custody, Jake felt a brief sense of relief, but it was fleeting. Grayson was just one piece of the puzzle, and Jake knew the real danger was far from over. With Grayson behind bars, Jake and Sarah began poring over the seized documents. They uncovered a list of names, locations, and even encrypted messages, all leading to other members of the trafficking syndicate. It was a sprawling operation that stretched across the country, with a network of powerful individuals protecting it. Jake and Sarah realized they had just scratched the surface, but they now had the evidence to bring down the entire organization. They weren't just fighting for Emily anymore, they were fighting for every victim who had ever been silenced by this underground world. As Jake continued to dig deeper into the operation, he realized he couldn't do it alone. The stakes were too high, and the enemies too powerful. He reached out to an old friend, FBI agent Marcus Owens, who had been working on similar cases. Marcus was known for his work in human trafficking cases and had the resources and connections to help them take down the larger syndicate. Marcus agreed to join forces, but he warned Jake that they were about to enter dangerous territory. The higher-ups in this operation were not just criminals, they were people with influence, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Together, the three of them began working on a strategy to infiltrate the organization. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined. Emily was still missing, and there were countless other victims who needed saving. They couldn't afford to fail. Days turned into weeks as Jake, Sarah, and Marcus tracked down every lead they could find. But nothing could prepare them for the breakthrough they had just stumbled upon. In one of the encrypted messages, they found a reference to a secret meeting taking place in a secluded mansion outside the city. It was a gathering of some of the most powerful figures involved in the trafficking ring, and it was happening soon. Jake knew this was their chance to infiltrate the heart of the operation. But it wasn't going to be simple. They had to gather enough evidence to expose the entire network while keeping their cover intact. They made plans to pose as buyers, entering the mansion under false pretenses, but they all understood the risks. If they were discovered, it would be the end for them, and Emily would be lost forever. With no time to waste, they made their move. The mansion loomed ahead, its lights dimmed and the air heavy with tension. Jake, Sarah, and Marcus arrived under the cover of night, dressed to blend in with the other guests. They were introduced to the high-ranking members of the syndicate, who were all too willing to discuss business in hushed tones, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. As they mingled, Jake's eyes scanned the room, noting the men and women who had participated in the underground trafficking operation. He recognized several faces from previous investigations, people who had managed to avoid justice for years. This was it, the heart of the syndicate. The criminals spoke in code, discussing shipments, payments, and transactions. Jake and Sarah carefully took note of every detail. The walls seemed to close in around them, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as they were about to leave the mansion, a conversation caught Jake's attention. One of the men mentioned a location, a place where young women were being held, and it hit Jake like a ton of bricks. The place was just outside the city, a former warehouse used to transport goods, and it was where Emily was likely being kept. Jake's heart raced. They had finally found her, but there was no time to waste. He signaled to Sarah and Marcus, and they slipped away from the crowd, quickly making their way to the exit. But as they approached their car, a black SUV pulled up, blocking their path. The doors opened, and out stepped several men, armed and dangerous. The trap had been set. The moment the men stepped out of the SUV, Jake knew they had been compromised. The men were too well prepared, and they knew exactly who Jake and his team were. "You've been a problem for far too long," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "We've been waiting for you." Jake's mind raced as he assessed the situation. He was outnumbered, but he couldn't afford to back down now, not when they were so close to finding Emily. A gunfight erupted as Jake, Sarah, and Marcus fought back, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Bullets whizzed by, and the air was thick with tension. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he fired back, taking down one of the attackers. But just as it seemed like they might get the upper hand, a familiar face appeared in the distance. It was Michael Grayson. He was free. Michael Grayson stood there, smirking, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Did you really think you could bring me down?" he taunted, his eyes cold and calculating. "I always have a backup plan." Jake's blood boiled with rage. Grayson had been pulling the strings all along, and now he was in control again. But this time, Jake wasn't going to let him escape. As the battle raged around them, Jake locked eyes with Grayson, determined to end this once and for all. Grayson's men were falling, but Michael was always one step ahead. It was clear that he had anticipated their every move. The fight was chaotic. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he ducked behind a parked car for cover, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets. The sound of gunfire echoed in the night, mingling with the roar of engines as the battle intensified. Sarah and Marcus were covering his back, but the numbers were against them. Grayson's men were well trained and determined to stop them at any cost. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The only way to end this was to confront Grayson directly. He had to put an end to this nightmare, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He made a quick move, darting from cover to cover, finally closing in on Grayson's position. The moment he caught sight of Michael, he rushed forward, his gun raised. But before he could get a shot off, Grayson's voice rang out, mocking him. "You think this is over?" Grayson taunted, stepping back into the shadows. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Jake wasn't about to let Grayson get away again. He took a steadying breath and charged toward the shadows where Michael had vanished, knowing that the time for hesitation was over. It was now or never. The night seemed to grow colder as Jake closed in on Grayson. The air was thick with the tension of impending violence. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, but he kept his pace steady, relying on his years of experience. Grayson was dangerous, and Jake knew this would be their final confrontation. He couldn't afford to be reckless. When he finally reached the abandoned warehouse where Grayson was hiding, Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. The building was dark, the only sound the echo of his footsteps on the cracked concrete floor. He crept forward, his senses heightened. Suddenly, Grayson appeared from the shadows, a cruel smile on his face, a gun in his hand. "You should have stayed out of this, Detective," Grayson said, his voice calm, almost amused. He aimed his gun at Jake, his finger twitching on the trigger. But Jake was faster. With a quick movement, Jake tackled Grayson to the ground, knocking the gun from his hand. They struggled, fists flying, but Jake was determined. He had come too far to let Grayson win. In the end, it was Jake's persistence that won out. He pinned Grayson to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over, Michael," he said, his voice low and filled with resolve. Grayson glared up at him, but there was no escape now. The reign of terror he had built was coming to an end. With Grayson captured, Jake's first priority was to find Emily. Time was running out. He and Sarah quickly scoured the warehouse, searching for any sign of her. They found a small locked room at the back of the building, and when they broke the door down, they found Emily, disoriented but alive. She looked up at them, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "Jake," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Jake rushed to her side, his heart swelling with relief. "It's okay, Emily. You're safe now," he said, gently taking her hand. They quickly escorted her out of the warehouse, where Marcus was waiting with the authorities. The rescue was a success, and Emily was finally free from the grip of Grayson's criminal empire. But even as they drove away from the scene, Jake knew their work wasn't done. Grayson's arrest was just the beginning. There were still many more victims out there, and it was up to them to ensure that justice was served. With Grayson behind bars, Jake and his team turned their attention to dismantling the entire human trafficking ring. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized that Grayson had been only one cog in a much larger machine. The network extended far beyond what they had originally thought. There were politicians, business moguls, and even law enforcement officials involved in the operation. The fight for justice was about to get even more dangerous. Jake and Sarah worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and making strategic moves to expose those at the top. But the closer they got to the truth, the more threats they received. It became clear that the people behind the operation would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But Jake wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. As the investigation continued, Sarah uncovered a key piece of evidence that could bring down the entire network. A former associate of Grayson's, who had been hiding in plain sight for years, had been keeping detailed records of every illegal transaction. The records were encrypted, but Sarah was confident she could crack the code. But as she worked on decrypting the files, she received a chilling message. It was from an anonymous source, warning her to stop digging into the case. The message was simple: leave it alone, or you'll regret it. Sarah knew that they were getting too close to the truth, and that the people behind the network would do anything to silence them. But there was no turning back now. They had to keep pushing forward. Just as they thought they were making progress, Jake's world came crashing down. One evening, Marcus disappeared. He had been a key part of the investigation, and his sudden absence was a red flag. Jake and Sarah frantically searched for any trace of him, but it was as if he had vanished without a trace. Days later, they received an unsettling phone call. It was Marcus, but the voice on the other end was cold and unfamiliar. "Jake, I've been compromised," Marcus said, his voice strained. "I was forced to betray you. They have my family. I didn't have a choice." Jake's heart sank. He knew that the people behind the trafficking network were powerful, but this was a betrayal that cut deep. Marcus was one of the few people he trusted, and now it seemed that even he had fallen victim to the syndicate. But Jake wouldn't give up. He couldn't let Marcus's family, or any other innocent people, suffer because of this operation. Jake and Sarah worked tirelessly to track down Marcus and expose the full extent of the trafficking network. With the encrypted files cracked, they had the evidence they needed to take down the remaining players in the syndicate. But even as they moved in, they knew the danger wasn't over. The network was vast, and its members were willing to do anything to protect their operation. The final confrontation was intense. With the help of law enforcement, Jake and Sarah launched a coordinated operation that spanned multiple cities. The arrests came fast, and one by one, the criminals fell. But Michael Grayson's name still loomed large. The investigation had revealed the depth of his involvement, but there were still questions that Jake needed answers to. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Jake knew that justice had been served. But the cost had been high. Marcus was safe, but many others hadn't made it. In the end, the fight wasn't just about bringing down a criminal. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless and ensuring that the horrors of the past would never happen again. Even with the criminals arrested and the network dismantled, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows. Grayson's empire had been vast, but as he studied the last of the evidence, it became clear that this was only the beginning. There were other players involved, people who had managed to stay in the background, their names untouched by the investigation so far. Jake wasn't ready to walk away, not when so much was still left unsaid. The weight of the past continued to haunt him. He couldn't forget the victims, those whose lives had been ruined by Grayson's operation. He made it his mission to meet with the survivors, to hear their stories and help them rebuild. But with each conversation, the bitterness of the system's failure stung him. The legal battles were far from over, and the pain for many of these families was far too deep to heal quickly. The investigation was supposed to be winding down, but Jake found himself pulling on a thread that wouldn't unravel. One of the men arrested in connection with the trafficking ring had connections to a politician, someone with enough influence to bury the truth. It was clear that there were powerful people who wanted to keep the investigation from reaching its final destination. Jake couldn't trust anyone now. The more he dug, the more secrets he uncovered, leading him to a dangerous realization. There were still people out there willing to do anything to protect their wealth and power. The shadowy figures had been pulling strings all along, and their grip on the system was tighter than ever. Jake had been too close to the truth for too long to back down now, but he knew the cost of his pursuit could be high. As Jake and Sarah prepared for their next move, they were met with resistance from unexpected sources. Several high-ranking officials in the law enforcement agencies were either corrupt or compromised, and their efforts to undermine Jake's investigation were becoming more apparent by the day. The stakes had risen, and with each twist, it became clear that the fight was about to take a darker turn. Jake's instincts told him that the conspiracy reached far beyond the criminal network they had already dismantled. The more he learned, the more it felt like he was up against an invisible army, one that had infiltrated every level of power. But no matter how many people tried to stop him, Jake couldn't let go. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore, it was a battle for the very soul of the system. The betrayals had been piling up, but this one hit hardest. Someone close to Jake had sold him out. He wasn't sure who it was, but it was someone who had been feeding information to the enemy. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. It was the final straw, and Jake knew he had to make a choice: keep fighting or walk away and protect the few people left who mattered to him. As the days passed, Jake found himself growing more isolated. The pressure of the case, the constant betrayals, and the relentless pursuit of the truth were starting to take their toll. He couldn't let anyone else close. He couldn't afford to trust anyone. The deeper he went, the more he realized just how far-reaching the corruption was. But even as the walls seemed to close in around him, Jake refused to give up. Jake and Sarah had uncovered a crucial lead, a connection between Grayson and a global network of corruption that stretched far beyond the United States. This wasn't just a local problem, it was a worldwide issue. The ring of criminals was only a small part of the larger conspiracy. The truth was more complex and dangerous than Jake could have imagined. But there was no turning back now. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when they discovered that some of the most powerful figures in the world, politicians, CEOs, and even international diplomats, had been secretly feeding Grayson's operation. They had used their influence to shield the trafficking ring from authorities for years, ensuring that it continued to thrive while innocent lives were destroyed. The world was watching, but no one had seen the truth until now. With the global network exposed, Jake knew the next phase of the investigation would be even more dangerous. These powerful individuals wouldn't go down without a fight. As Jake and Sarah planned their next steps, they were met with renewed threats, this time from people with resources far beyond anything they had faced before. The stakes had grown exponentially. Everywhere Jake turned, there were signs that the people behind the conspiracy were willing to do anything to protect their empire. Even with the evidence they had gathered, there was no guarantee of success. The legal system had its flaws, and those with power were masters at exploiting them. But Jake had come too far to give up now. He had seen too much suffering to back down, and he was determined to see the case through to the end, no matter the cost. The pressure was overwhelming, But Jake and Sarah kept pushing forward. The network they were up against was massive, and the people involved would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As they connected more dots, they realized just how many innocent lives had been impacted. The scale of the operation was staggering, and the fight for justice was far from over. In the end, it wasn't just about taking down criminals, it was about restoring the trust that had been lost in the system. The battle for justice had taken its toll on Jake, but he remained unwavering in his pursuit of the truth. As the final pieces of the conspiracy were exposed, Jake knew that the cost of justice had been high, but it was a price he was willing to pay. The day of reckoning had arrived. Jake and his team had gathered all the evidence they needed, and now it was time to confront the remaining members of the conspiracy. The operation was set in motion, and the tension was palpable. Everyone knew that this was the final opportunity to bring down the powerful figures behind the network. Failure was not an option. As Jake stood on the front lines of the final confrontation, he knew that this battle was more than just about the case, it was about the future. If they failed, the cycle of corruption would continue. But if they succeeded, they could change the course of history. The pressure was immense, but Jake remained focused. He had come too far to lose now. Just when they thought they were closing in on the last of the criminals, another betrayal rocked Jake's world. Someone they trusted had been working for the enemy all along. It was the final blow to his already fragile trust in the people around him. But even as the feeling of betrayal stung, Jake knew he couldn't let it stop him. The final confrontation was still on the horizon. Jake would stop at nothing to ensure that those responsible for the crimes would face justice. He wasn't going to let them get away with it, not after everything he had sacrificed. It was time to take down the empire once and for all. With the betrayal fresh in his mind, Jake set his focus entirely on the task ahead. He had lost trust in so many people, but he knew that the fight was bigger than just his personal pain. The criminals who had caused so much suffering were still out there, their empire still thriving. Jake had no choice but to push forward, despite the emotional and psychological toll. Redemption wasn't just for him, it was for every victim, every family that had been torn apart by the network. Jake and Sarah worked tirelessly, using every ounce of their energy and resources to bring down the last few players in the game. They could see the light at the end of the tunnel, but the road to it was treacherous. The threats had escalated, and there were signs that the conspiracy's power wasn't just limited to money, it extended to controlling people and manipulating the system. Jake couldn't afford to fail now. The moment of truth arrived when Jake and Sarah received intelligence that the ring's leaders were gathering for a secret meeting. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. With no time to waste, Jake coordinated with a trusted team, preparing for the biggest operation of his career. The criminals might have been powerful, but they underestimated one thing: the unwavering determination of those fighting for justice. As the operation unfolded, it became clear that the scope of this criminal network was even more vast than anyone had imagined. Global politicians, corporate moguls, and celebrities were implicated in the conspiracy, and the people behind it had nearly become untouchable. But now, the reckoning was coming. There would be no more hiding. The truth was going to shake the world to its core. Jake knew that the moment they raided the last hideout, the operation would come to an explosive end. Everything had been meticulously planned, but there was no way to predict how the criminals would react. Jake and Sarah took their positions, and the tension in the air was thick. As they inched closer to the final chapter of their investigation, Jake realized that this wasn't just about exposing criminals anymore. This was about exposing the systems that allowed such corruption to fester for so long. The raid was swift, but the criminals weren't going down without a fight. It became an all-out battle, not just in the streets, but in the media and the courtrooms. The conspiracy's tentacles reached deep into the legal system, and even as arrests were made, lawyers were prepared to block every move. Jake knew this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The media coverage of the operation was relentless. As the names of the implicated figures came to light, the public's shock was palpable. Names that had once been untouchable were now part of a larger narrative of greed and exploitation. As public outrage grew, the legal battles became even more intense. The powerful figures fought back with everything they had: money, influence, and their deep connections within the system. But Jake couldn't back down now. He had come too far. He fought not just for justice, but for the people who had been victims of a system that had failed them for too long. Every victory in court, every arrest made, was a small victory in the fight for a more just society. But the fight was far from over. The pressure reached its peak as the trial of the century began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of victims, and even some of the very criminals Jake had been working to expose. The odds were stacked against them. The defense lawyers pulled every trick in the book to discredit the evidence, but Jake remained resolute. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let the criminals slip through the cracks. As the trial dragged on, Jake and Sarah faced personal challenges. The strain of years of investigation was taking a toll on their health, and the emotional scars from all they had seen were beginning to show. Yet, they continued to fight, side by side, determined to see this case through to the end. It wasn't just about winning, it was about making a difference. As the trial reached its climax, Jake found himself facing the unthinkable. The criminals, once untouchable, were finally going to be brought to justice. The key players in the conspiracy, from politicians to CEOs, were being held accountable for their actions. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief and anticipation, as the scale of their crimes became undeniable. But the victory didn't come without sacrifice. For every criminal arrested, another scandal broke, revealing just how far-reaching their influence had been. The media exposed more connections, and Jake found himself at the center of a storm. While it was clear that the tide was turning in favor of justice, the battle was far from over. There was still work to be done to dismantle the corrupt systems that had allowed these crimes to happen in the first place. With the final verdict handed down, Jake looked back on the years of his investigation. He had started with a simple desire to make things right, but the journey had been anything but simple. It had taken everything from him: his trust in others, his sense of safety, and sometimes even his hope in the system he'd sworn to protect. Yet, in the end, the truth had won. The criminals were behind bars, and the world was beginning to wake up to the corruption that had once been invisible. Jake knew that the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. The system was far from perfect, and the fight for justice wasn't over. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle had been long, and it had taken its toll, but Jake had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the darkness and brought light to a world that had been suffering in silence. And as the sun set on the city, Jake knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of a much larger movement. The fight for justice wasn't just about one case, it was about the future, the fight to ensure that no one would ever have to suffer in silence again.